Welcome to Edge of the Rabbit Hole, where tonight we have author and researcher Freddy Silva with us. Coming up next.
You've got to look young.
Welcome back, everybody, to Edge of the Rabbit Hole. I'm author and ghost historian Mike Ricksecker. With me, as always, is Vanessa Hogel, my co-hostess. And down in the chat room, our chat shenanigator, Shauna, shenanigating everything down there as she usually does. We have a fantastic guest with us this evening. Really been looking forward to this. Freddy Silva, author and researcher. He's been on a number of shows, History Channel, GAIA, a lot of different documentaries, wealth of knowledge in the house, is written. I don't even know how many books. What, about at least a half dozen, right, Freddie?
We're up to 6 right now.
Up to 6. There we go. A half dozen. Have one of them right here in Divine Blueprint. So, Freddie, welcome. Really great to have you aboard tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I first came across your work when I was doing some research on ley lines, energy grids, standing stones, and all of that. And what fascinated me, at least to start, I mean, all your work is fascinating, and you cover so many different areas. But I think a great place to kind of start, because we've talked about this on our show before, is there is actually a difference between what we usually commonly call ley lines and energy grids and telluric currents. So what is that difference? Because even I'm still a little iffy on what the differences are.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure how the two got mixed up in the first place, because ley lines are actually geometric alignments. So let's say you have 3 elements which are connected together by age or purpose. And if you connect those in a straight line, that's a ley. Energy lines are very different. They are the telluric currents. You can call them all kinds of things, whether you're talking about the ferry paths in Ireland or the Lung Mei in China, the serpent lines in Egypt. It's the same thing. Science likes to call them telluric currents because, science likes to give things names that we can't remember very well. It's the way it is. But sometimes the two are actually connected. And England's a great place to start with that because we have one of the most studied energy lines in the world, which is the Michael and Mary lines. And they're called that because of the amount of churches, sacred sites, standing stones, holy wells, which are aligned in a perfect straight line from one end of the country to the other. And that actually also forms a ley because you can draw a straight line like a big sword all the way through those. And incredibly, when you keep following that line, you end up at the main site in Tiwanaku called Pumapunku. So that definitely suggests that there's also something much bigger at play, that our ancestors also weren't just doing things 5,000 years ago. They're also plotting some kind of a big energy grid around the Earth as much as 15,000 years ago. Because Pumapunku and, let's say, Stonehenge, they are separate by quite a large number of time. So it is part of a geodetic pattern that goes around the world, connecting all the sacred sites together. And of course, the big question is, how do they figure all this out without satellite technology?
I have a question real quick, just in regards to those particular lines and how you said that certain things line up with churches, wells, everything else. Have you been able to notice a pattern of violence that seems to follow along those lines, historical or even present day, or does it seem to disperse close to those lines and branch out?
Did you say violence?
Yes.
Wow, I haven't heard that one before. No, I've just experienced nothing but peace, love, and understanding along these lines. Although sometimes throughout history, you do get the odd sort of despot that takes over power, and he usually goes around to all these sacred sites and tries to figure out what is the big treasure in them, because you get these stories that these places have a kind of treasure. And of course, they're thinking about this from a monetary point of view. They don't see the treasure as being knowledge or enlightenment, so they end up killing the people who are protecting these sites. So that's when the violent part comes in. One of the best examples, of course, is Glastonbury Abbey, which of course is part of that Michael and Mary line alignment in Britain. And there was a time when Henry VIII was looking for that kind of information, and he ended up killing just about everybody from the cook all the way to the bishop in very gruesome terms. But at the same time, he then destroyed the entire abbey. And of course, the abbey was the treasure. So that is the time when you do get the opposite attracting, where these places stand for light and enlightenment, and at the same time they do by nature attract their very opposite, just by the fact that they do stand for something that these rulers obviously don't stand up for. So there are those moments when they do attract that violence, but as as all things happen, once that's over, it's a short period in history when these things happen, and the light resurges back to these sites, and the grid, bless you,
Thank you.
the grid resurges again. So, no, I tend to think that more often than not, it tends to be these places tend to be much more attractive to people who just work with much more ethereal elements in life. And I have a very good theory about this, that the more weird you behave, and you dress up in white, you start, waiting to the stars, it actually keeps people away, I find. So as long as you behave weirdly at these places, they leave us alone to get us on with the really important work.
Yeah, don't hide your crazy, people.
Oh,
don't
God,
hide it.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to go. I've tried to go to some of the places around here. I haven't yet ventured over to to the UK, to Scotland, Ireland. I'd love to get to all those places over there. I haven't yet been, unfortunately. But some of the location, I will. Some things are lining up, but
over America as well.
Yeah, they're all over here in America. I lived in Ohio for a number of years, so I was at the Great Circle Earthworks a few different times there. Here, where I'm at in Illinois now, right down the road from Cahokia Mounds, and to me, very different in that Cahokia is right next to a major highway, and so my girlfriend Shauna and I were up there just a couple months ago, and just trying to kind of take in whatever energy might be there. I was really getting distracted by the highway. So do you find that it's our modern technology and conveniences are distracting now to these sites that are still there? Because I imagine you could still tap into that energy at these sites, but perhaps that modern technology is kind of interfering a little bit?
No, quite the opposite. They're so
Really?
well protected. There's a certain technology at work. I call it a spiritual technology because it literally is the power of the will to imprint information and an intent into the sites. That's why the stones are always dragged from a long way away and they're packed with quartz. So applying the right attention and intention to the stones, you can actually send a packet of information, which is your intent, to the actual quartz in the stones, and the stones remember. In other words, they were working pretty much the way we program a computer, which works with silica, which is exactly the same medium. And I find that these places are very self-protecting. If you go to, I just came back from Egypt and we had exactly the same question. There are times where, it's rare. We have the places to ourselves. Giza, of course, is run around with people like crazy. You can't concentrate for 5 seconds. You have to use a lot more of your sort of inner guidance to sort of shield all the distractions out. It requires more effort on our part. But the magic is there. And I usually find that when people go away, during those quiet times, that's when the magic really appears. And I have been to Cahokia. It's very magical, but it does require a lot more effort on our part in the modern era to connect with that final layer of reality, because these things are energy devices. They are living organisms. There's been studies done by Princeton, of all people, that actually measures the energy of a site like an Egyptian temple or a mound, and they found that just the energy by itself of the place is as high as a group of meditating people. And we have done studies with people who, like a group of meditating monks, for example, and there is a certain frequency that comes from those groups and a certain frequency that's generated by them. So the temple, although we look at it as a bunch of rocks, actually has the same amount of energy coming out from it by itself. So that when you go in there with the right intent, under the right circumstances, and hopefully not too many people around, it behaves very differently. There's a bigger sense of energy about it, a big sense of presence, and when the two collide, the temple and the individual collide, it creates an expanded awareness like you would never believe. We just had a meditation at the Osirian of Abydos in Egypt, which is, very hard to get a special permission to go in there. So, we watched busloads of tourists move in Abydos and move out. And then after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we go in there. It's supposed to be an underground temple, but actually it was actually once a freestanding structure, which tells you that it must have been there for over 14,000 years. The Nile mud has simply gone around it. And, we took a few moments to ourselves, and for a good hour, we did a quiet meditation there. The guards are all around us, and they're amazed by the amount of respect we had for the place. It's like we didn't come here just to snap photographs. We came here literally to honor the site, and they reacted to it. I mean, they were really very welcoming, and they began to open up much more about what was going on nearby, what they had seen, what they had experienced. So these guys who are going around with a big Kalashnikov protecting the tourists in Egypt, once they realize that we're there to honor their history, they really open up to a lot of experiences, and they'll say the same thing, that they'll be guarding it in the middle of the night. They see strange, unusual things coming in and out, balls of light flying in and out. And these are hardened army people talking like this. So if they can pick it up, so can you and I.
I was at Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, and that's the closest I've ever come to feeling complete peace.
Oh, really?
Complete peace. Simply with the way that the stones jut up, they almost form chairs, almost like thrones, to be able to sit in, and the energy that was coming off of the water that seemed to be bouncing off of these just amazing stones that are these completely uneven steps for everybody. You were able to totally shut out every other person there, and it was total peace.
Oh, absolutely.
I know what you're talking about, and I wonder, is there a difference between the vibration of a place like that is right there waterside, as opposed to the landlocked locations or the underground chambers like you're talking about? Have they checked those for different vibration frequencies, and are there variations in it?
Oh, very much so. Each one is its own radio station. I have a good trick I play on people when we go to Giza. There are 3 pyramids, main pyramids, and I ask people, which one's your favorite? And they all react to different ones, and I'll say, but they're all pyramids. Why are you saying this one feels better than the other one? And of course, they can't explain it. Now, I know the difference because each one was built for a different reason. Each one is built to a specific geometry, and the geometry affects the actual internal feel of each building, and also the actual impact that you get visually. It works on a very subtle level because, our DNA is also made of the same geometry, fundamentally. So you're getting a reaction based on something that you're observing, but your body's picking it up. And it's funny because at the end of the trip, people will change their minds totally, because now, after they've gone 10 days experiencing different sites and soaking up a little bit of the energy of each, like blotting paper, they'll go back to the Giza and I'll say, now, which one did you like now? And they'll completely flip around, because you've now attuned to the building. You're much more attuned to the subtlety of things. So it doesn't matter where they are, it's how they're worked. Kind of like the more you water a plant, the better it responds, the more alive it grows. So the temples are the same way. The more attention you give them, more respect you give them, the more they react in kind. Some of them haven't fared very well. Stonehenge, with all the millions of tourists, the little choo-choo train you have to take there now, it's a bit like Disneyland. They shut down one of the main roads, which is a huge help. But still, it gets a lot of trivial attention, and you go there, and it's really disappointing. Now, if you're lucky enough to be one of the few people after hours to get special access, and you go there with the right intent, it opens up like a flower, responding unquestionably to sunlight. And it's a very different feeling altogether. So it's a combination. It depends on what they've been built for. They've all been built for completely different purposes. How long they've been there, which of course they've been soaking up prayers and intent for thousands of years, and that adds to the essence of the spirit of place. and also who's looking after it. The more they're looked after, the more groups like the ones I take around to sacred sites work with these places, the more they seem to bloom quietly. They do things very, very quietly. So it doesn't matter where they are. Even Ohio, the Serpent Mound, that's a magical place. And it gets bombarded with tourists all the time, but it's well looked after. And sometimes even the simplest mounds in North America or the simplest standing stones in France, they can pack as much punch as a big pyramid. So not even the size matters, it's the quality of energy and how long it's been looked after that's important.
Yeah, Freddie, going back to the pyramids, I've seen other interviews with you where you have talked about doing light work at the pyramid, specifically the King's Chamber, when you got a moment there alone. So I'm curious as to what exactly was going on there, and I know our viewers would love to hear that story as to what happened in there. And I guess you were trying to tune the pyramid. Is that exactly what was going on?
We were trying to, I belong to a group of people who works very quietly behind the scenes to clean up the mess that people leave behind at sacred sites. And there's a lot of mess that goes on. People often go to these places not really knowing what's going on. They'll do very silly things and they'll regret it afterwards. And so there's the building. The building remembers everything that goes on. The building is an energetic organism. It doesn't give a down one way or the other about the energy. It's the fact that it is energy to begin with. So what you bring in is what remains in the building. So after people have done silly things in the Great Pyramid and doing witchcraft and all kinds of other weird things, it needs a bit of a cleanup. And back in the day when I was kind of still halfway not knowing what the hell I was doing, which is also a great way to learn, by the way, because you can fall flat on your face and you learn pretty quickly. I had the advantage of having some great teachers in my life, and we were going to the Great Pyramid to honor the building, do a little bit of quiet work, just cleanse the energy in there. And we were left alone in the mid-morning, which never, ever happens in the Great Pyramid. There are at least 2,000 people running in and out like banshees. It's hell. It's hot. It's humid. You drop a pin in the building, and you can hear it reverberating like a Black Sabbath concert. You have to be very careful in there. You have to be very quiet, very respectful. It's a perfectly tuned resonant cavity. So everybody leaves the building. We hadn't been able to get special access for a whole bunch of reasons. And suddenly there's 4 guys, which is really unusual. Usually there's a token guy and 3 women. But on this occasion, there's 4 guys in there, including myself. And the lights went off. We're in complete darkness in the King's Chamber. And we thought, right, this is a rare moment. Let's go and do what we've been trained to do, which is clean up the place. And I began to sort of tune into the actual space, which is another method that we do to find out the resonance of the building. Each room has its own particular vibration. And you start picking up on these notes, and I'd never, ever in my life come up with tones coming out of my body like that. It was almost like Hindu chant, and I don't do that kind of stuff. And it felt so good, and everybody else joined in, and before you know it, and again, we're in complete darkness. We are not expecting anything. We don't really know much about the early history of the building at that time. And suddenly, as these 3 people are my witness, about 30 people came out of the stones, dressed in these beautiful white costumes, surrounded us. They could have been about 8.5 feet tall. They were quite tall. And you can't see their faces. Their cowls are all the way up, down to their nose. And they just bowed, and I bowed back in total darkness. And I thought, this is absolutely amazing. I hope someone else can watch this. Anyway, about 15 minutes later, the lights come back on. There's a very annoyed Arab person at the bottom of the Grand Chamber yelling that we shouldn't be in there doing this kind of thing. It's against regulations. And we thought, well, let's just finish off here because we've got away with murder in here. And we took turns just doing a couple of things in the box. I won't call it a sarcophagus because no one's ever been buried in there.
Right.
We left the building, went outside, and we're completely dazed. I mean, it's clear that 4 guys have had an experience. No one wants to talk about it because we're trying to be guy-ish. And I said, all right, I'll go first. I'm sort of the girly man in the group. I said, all right, did anybody see what I saw in there? And every one of them just broke down and said, yeah, I mean, there were the people that came out of the stones when you did this toning, and they were 8.5 feet tall, and they were dressed in white. So we all agreed. 4 of us saw all these people coming out of the stones. And at that moment, we went really quiet. And the gravity of the situation, it was extraordinary. And the best part is that when we got back with the rest of the group that hadn't got in, they were tuning in to us to find out what we were up to. And our fearless, glorious leader, who's one of the best psychics I've ever met in the entire world, she says, well, we didn't say anything, by the way. We did not say a word. And she actually described everything that I've just told you, which is fantastic confirmation for her and for us. And I've taken groups in there since then. Many of them don't know the story. And I never know what to expect. I always tell people, don't expect anything at sacred sites, and you will be pleasantly surprised. You go in there expecting something, nothing ever happens. That's just the way it is. And the last group I had in there about a year ago, there were 16 people, and we started the whole thing. And again, I saw about 16 people coming out of the stones, and they surrounded my group in the King's Chamber, and they had their arms out like this. And I thought, I hope someone's not thinking of collapsing and falling backwards and cracking their head on the granite floor, because I see the word lawsuit coming here.
Right.
How going to sue the building, I'm not sure. And afterwards, at dinner, I asked people, did anybody experience anything, any impressions, no matter how crazy they are, because I like hearing crazy expressions. And half of the group said, you know, the moment you started doing some sounds, I felt someone very tall coming up behind me, and they had their arms out like this, like I felt I could fall backwards and I could be totally safe. And I figured, wow, 8 people, that's 50% of the group, experienced that as well. So I'm not the only one. And going back to 1924, there's another writer that actually spent the whole night in there. He describes the same people in exactly the same way. And I hadn't even read the book before I actually had my experience. So it's a special place. It very well is. It's a unique portal. But then so are so many other places around it like that.
Who do you think these light beings are? Any idea?
Yes, I do actually. In fact, if anybody's familiar with Utah and the Horseshoe Canyon, which is one hell of a good walk in 104 degrees heat, with 8 bottles of water in your backpack.
Yeah.
It's just north of Monument Valley, and just before you get into Colorado. And there's a wonderful panel there. It's called a ghost panel. It's a terrible name for it. And it shows 7 figures with a taller 8th, and they are cloaked exactly the same way that I saw these people. And I spoke to Clifford Mahuti, he's the Zuni elder, and I loved hearing everything that he has to say, because he's so wonderful with the stories. And I was telling him about my thing to complete the full circle. I want to go and see this panel. Finally, in my life, I always wanted to see this. And he said, and I said, I think I know who they are. I think I've met these people before. And he says, well, you have met them before. We call them the lookers. And I said, wait a minute, are these the watchers that you're talking about? I said, yes, they're the watchers. And they're the same people that were behind the original crop circles that you wrote a really good book about. And I went, my God, I feel like I've completed the whole story of my life that goes back to, 1998? 20-year cycle. And I've met him again here and there in other places around the world. There are certain sites which they are intimately collected. And in the new book that I just written, by the way, I go into great detail, really rescuing the watchers from the bad press they had over the years, along with the Anunnaki, who get a lot of negative press. People should read the original stories from Mesopotamia and the Book of Enoch, because these are very benevolent people, and they're very concerned about our position here on Earth, and that's why they keep coming back to these sites. They use these portals as a place to connect with people, and also to measure how we're doing as a consciousness, and also to help elevate our consciousness as well. It's a very long story. I'm trying to sort of condense this into a nutshell. But I keep coming across them again and again, so I guess I have a certain relationship with them. I come to see them as family because I've had nothing but good experiences from them, and I'm sure they've also helped me write some good stuff along the way.
Have you ever heard of the 9 Ladies Stone Circle in England?
The Merry Maidens.
Have you been there?
I have, yes.
How did you feel?
It depends on the time of the month, and I don't mean that I'm having a period. I'm talking about that.
I figured.
I'm not that into my feminine side. It's the circles respond in a different way depending on the cycle of the moon.
Yes.
And those sites are very much related to the cycle of the moon. And sometimes they're much more accentuated than others. Sometimes you go there in the new moon cycle and it goes, okay, it's nice, but it's just okay, it's pleasant. But as you start getting to the 2/3 stage of the cycle of the moon towards full moon, oh, it really picks up nicely. You can actually feel it moving and going around. You can hear things whispering, even at the crack of dawn or last thing at night after the pub closes, about 11 o'clock at night. 11:30 at night, for some reason, there's something else going on. And if you're very fortunate and daring, because it is Cornwall, it's wet, it's damp, it's cold, it's windy and miserable. If you go there between 2 and 3 in the morning and have a quiet meditation, it's very special. You definitely are connected to a lot of things.
I haven't got to go yet. I remote.
Oh, I figured you'd been there.
No, I remote viewed for a team that was investigating there, and they got a live feed. They got a live EVP of them asking for me by name.
Yeah. They're very much alive. I mean, it's like the Egyptians.
It is very much alive.
Oh, very much so. I mean, the Egyptians used to actually treat each part of the temple as a living being. They would go around before dawn and they would wake up each part of the temple, each room, with a sound as though you're waking a person from slumber. For them, the temple is an organic being. And we've done experiments in England and a whole bunch of them in Egypt as well to show that all these places are alive. We've planted electrodes on the ground, which shows that just before dawn, all the magnetic energy of the land and also the solar wind, which connects to these very thin fibers from the sky to the ground, they begin to get attracted to the stone circles, the pyramids, the henge monuments. And just before dawn, when the sun just comes to the horizon, a doorway opens at the entrance to these temples, and suddenly all the energy gets circling around the sides, and then it goes into the side towards the altar at twice the frequency of the local land. Now, science is at pains to understand how that can be possible. The sites themselves are doubling the energy of the surrounding landscape and attracting it to them at the crack of dawn. And of course, just like a person that gets up early, but as the day goes by, the energy goes down and down and down. And, by about 8 o'clock at night, they're like you and I, they've had enough. They want to go to the pub, have a quiet drink, have a meal, and then go to sleep. And then the whole process begins again. So this is why I always tell people, you've got to be careful with these places because they are sensitive. They can easily be offended. And there's a lot of stories in Europe that talk about the sites being easily offended and the kind of stories in which they portray a green monster or a dragon or a fairy. These are just mechanisms to help you understand the invisible world and how you should pay respect to these people, to these beings. And if you do, they'll react in kind. So it's a wonderful relationship you can develop no matter where you are in the world. And if you happen to be feeling a little bit out of sorts, a little bit out of connection with your environment or out of connection with yourself, that's one place I recommend you go to. Go to a sacred site. Even here in North America, there is plenty of sites to go to, like the Native American mounds. Most of them, there's no one buried there. There was a reason why they're there, and it wasn't for burial, not originally. And they are literally marking the hot spots where the lines of force intersect for people like in our era who can't see them anymore. Of course, if you can see them, it's not a big deal. But for people who lose the plot, you'd know where to go and sit if you wanted to connect with yourself and with the bigger scheme of things. I actually call them self-help centers. It's a very, very cheap ways to heal yourself and heal your soul.
Cheap ways are good.
Absolutely.
There you go. There you go.
We like cheap.
We do. We do.
Even better than drugs. I have these fascinating arguments with Graham Hancock and Daniel Pinchbeck. They keep inviting me to come to New York to do ayahuasca, and it's not really my bag. I actually say to them, I'd rather not have to go through the dieting, the vomiting, the loss of your bowels, just to see images. I can do the same thing by standing to a large upright rock somewhere, or standing on a mound and having that quiet time with the spirit of the place. I can get the same stuff without the side effects. So we laugh about it, but it's a tool like any other. Some people do ayahuasca, some people go on shamanic tours, some people stand inside pyramids, some people just tune into sacred sites and get the same hit. It's a big toolbox.
Yeah, all those other side effects from the drugs, not fun at all.
It doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't sound fun. No, not at all.
You lose a lot of weight, though.
I guess that would be a bonus, sure. But there's other things we could do for that as well. We do have a couple of things to take care of down from the chat. So Tom McNicholas had given a $5 super chat. He said, "Happy Earth Day a day late." So thank you very much, Tom. Absolutely appreciate that. We do have a few questions from down in the chat as well. So from Robert Hanna, Freddie, do you think that the Egyptians used the energy there to build the pyramids?
Oh, the big question. I've always said that if anybody really knows how they were built, they're lying. We have an idea, a theory that's going around. I'll give you my particular theory, and it's all based on observation and the mythology. Mythology is a great tool for understanding real facts. If you can unscramble the myth, that's the hard part. If you travel enough around the world as I do and you start comparing myths, there are similarities that suddenly pop up. And that is, the temples are built overnight. The temples are huge, the stones are huge, and the stones always come from a long, long, long way away, which led me to then look at the type of rock that they were using. Why is this rock so important? And the one thing that always connected them was huge amount of a specific type of quartz, iron and magnetite. All of these rocks, these temples are always packed with these things. So it led to the other connection, which is legend. And that was, how did they build these things overnight? And they said, well, the stones flew through the air to the sound of a trumpet or a vocal command. And you see this repeated again and again and again and again. Now, if our ancestors were that dumb that they didn't get around very much, which is the academic argument, these people didn't have contact with each other. Well, how did the stories become so identical? Did we all have the same hallucination? Did we plagiarize each other across time and space? Well, Princeton asked this same question about 30 years ago. Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. I don't think they're still going. I think that people like Robert Yarn, who used to head it, are now so old that they've retired, and I don't even know if they have the budget to carry this on. But their mandate was to look at the fine line between science and mysticism. Is there some way to bend that gray area between the two and find out, can we apply science to this? Well, yes, you can. And they found out. And they have lots of peer-reviewed experiments, one of which shows taking that specific type of quartz, a little bit of it, putting it in a little tube, and they start throwing sound frequency at it, and they throw amplitude at it. And once they finally experimented and got the two together, there's a certain relationship that happened between the sound frequency, the amplitude, and the quartz lifts off the ground. I think it might still be available online in the Princeton website. There was a clip, because I remember it clearly as daylight, because otherwise I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't. And it's one of my favorite stories that connects what we're trying to find out now to validate ancient myth. And I do believe there's something to be said to this. There was an art of science back in the day, 11, 12,000 years ago, certainly before the flood, because that's when these stories come from, that they talk about the same thing, the specific use of sound to create a resonant effect on the things, not just to move things, but also to destroy things. And we know we can do that today with infrasound, by the way. If you send a wave of infrasound with a careful amplitude at an object, it will kill people. There's a famous case in France where they were testing the French policeman's whistle. No one could figure out what it was about the design of the whistle that made it heard 5-10 blocks away. I mean, this thing is really loud, and the whistle is no bigger than an American policeman's whistle. So what was it about it? Well, they made a large version of it in the laboratory. They put compressed air. They asked the technician to go ahead and pump the compressed air while people next door were monitoring the equipment. All they heard was a thud, and nothing happened. They called next door and they said, Are you still there? Nothing. They walked next door and they found a technician next to the whistle dead.
Wow.
And they opened him up and his entire body had been liquidized on the inside. That's the power of infrasound, sound below the human hearing range. And conversely, sound above the human hearing range actually alters your state of consciousness. And that's the frequency that's often found in the sacred sites. So there is an old technology that's still hardwired in the temples, which is why chanting, toning, and getting to the right space with the right environment can lead you to open that little wormhole, that rabbit hole that takes you through these portals into another time, space dimension, and then brings you back again, hopefully, and hopefully as a much more enlightened person. So I am very much of the opinion that the combination of all these things with the stone, strategic placement of the sites, always at the cross lines of the Earth's energy currents, because that's a big clue. If you can levitate a rock and you put them on a current, like a conveyor belt, a child could have pushed a block of stone at 1,100 tons weight along this conveyor belt. It was child's play. Can I prove that? No, but I think we're so close now to proving it through what we've done at Princeton that we're pretty close to figuring out.
That really makes sense, what you're saying, based on something that I saw. I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I did say where it was believed that quartz is neither liquid nor solid, that it is a vibrating organism, that it vibrates at such a high frequency that it does not appear as liquid, yet it isn't truly solid. So that really does make a lot of sense to me. If you could find, without a doubt, the vibrational frequency that it is pulsating at, then you could do exactly what you just said. And it was some certain, I don't know, tens of thousands of megahertz is what they said it was, if I'm remembering correctly. But that basically, if all of that frequency was gone, it would disappear almost, because it's neither one nor the other.
Yeah, if you follow that logic through, absolutely. You can alter the molecular structure of anything by changing its inherent frequency. I don't think we've got there yet. I think we have it, we lost it, and now it probably won't be resurgent until we actually grow up as human beings. If you can think about this, the implications of what we're talking about here for a second, moving stones through the air and changing the molecular structure of things, the construction industry would basically have a hotel on every square inch within a day across the face of the planet.
True enough.
You could be erecting high-rise buildings willy-nilly. You could be doing a lot of nefarious things with it. I think that we're close to understanding it. I don't think we're harnessing it, and I don't think we will until we've moved forward and progressed in maturity. Certainly, at least with spiritual maturity. And I think it's kind of a paradox and also a kind of a mirror that 12,000 years ago, they were really discussing this in the traditions of the temples before the Great Flood. And yet we lost it, and now we're slowly at the very point where we are faced with total extinction again. And we really are. I mean, we really are facing a massive problem climatically and also geologically. I think we're coming to that realization that we've had something before, and the only way we're going to resolve our problems today is by growing up and becoming much more mature spiritually and in terms of ethics, in order to rediscover this technology and use it for the right action. I think it's a case of history repeating itself 12,000 years later. It's just a theory I have. It's a hunch. But I see things repeating themselves in big cycles, and the Indians will say this as well. And I mean this from India, not Native America. They talked about the same thing about the cycles, how if the end of one cycle will basically finish when we haven't learned the lessons, and only at the end of the next cycle we will look back and go, wait a minute, they knew something and we totally abused it, and only now at the very end we're going to rediscover it. So I think we're in that fine line of timing, where we are beginning to kind of wake up. We're also facing politicians who are also pushing back. The old order is pushing back as much as possible. But I feel confident when I see people like that wonderful Swedish schoolgirl, I can't remember her name, who basically has instigated a mass walkout of school children in Europe. She was just in London a few days ago, where I was, And thousands of children just walked out and said, if the grown-ups can't do it, we're not going to go to school. What's the point of going to school if we don't have a world to live in? And they are now part of the change. I'm very encouraged by that.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? You're going to put school children in jail for not going to school? Of course you're not. And so I see parallels here to what happened 11,000 years ago in the myths. And we're now discovering the kind of technology that I think we lost, and now we're on the verge of reusing it for hopefully much more progressive purposes.
Hopefully.
Yeah, certainly. So
yeah, you gotta think positively.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why are we here?
Now, I've heard you talk about sound and this type of technology before, also with your research in crop circles and their formations, the real ones, not the ones that people go out and make, but the actual but actual real crop circles that do happen. So is it the actual sound itself that is making this formation actually occur? And I've also heard you talk about how these are actually sites themselves where you can start to harness this energy. So how does all that work?
It was one of the big components in the creation of crop circles. We had the information from our good psychic friend in England before the crop circles even began to appear. Of course, she had no idea what the hell they were talking about. I mean, she's downloading information and they're saying it's all to do with sound. There are symbols that will be appearing at certain places within 7 days of your Earth time, and it will lead to a mass change of human consciousness. And it's also to do with the illusion of gravity. And of course, it took me about, 10 years, however long I worked on this project to get this book out, to finally bring all those things together, again, using science to back up the psychic material. So this is kind of an interesting thing. You're starting off with psychic information and you're slowly finding the science to back it up to prove that something actually works. A strange way to work, but it really worked well in the end, because we did find out that there was sound frequency being involved. People in the military would often be the first witnesses to crop circles. They would hear the sounds, and we're able to figure out that, yes, they do operate on the ultrasonic spectrum and also the infrasonic spectrum, because the changes in consciousness and what they were doing to some of the plants, is in the higher frequency range. What they're doing to the actual genetics of the plants and the changes to the soil, that was in the infrasonic level. And we could prove all that by pure physics. It could even, so what would happen was, to put this into kind of a perspective that we can understand, there are 80 eyewitnesses that have seen the crop circles appearing as a result of a tube of light that suddenly comes through the cloud like a cookie cutter, comes down to the ground, swirls the crop within 15 seconds, regardless of the size of this stuff, and then retracts and the crop circles in front of you. And part of it's to do with the spiraling of sound, which also creates its own energy field. So you might be wondering, how is that possible? Well, it turns out that when you actually activate sound to 40 octaves above the human hearing range, you create light. It's a phenomenon called sonoluminescence. Light is now in the electromagnetic spectrum, which means that you can actually create, in a tight spiral, a self-enclosed geometric shape, because that's basically this byproduct of a sound frequency when it hits a physical substance. By way of expression, that's you again. Keep drinking the Jack Daniels. I mean, the remedy. When you throw sound at powder, for example, as the work of Hans Jenny, for example, we call it cymatics, you can quite clearly see each sound frequency has its own geometric shape when it hits, for example, sand or powder. Thousands of experiments have been shown to this. And we found a correlation between the work of Hans Jenny and the images that he made in the laboratory with specific sound frequencies and how they relate to crop circle frequencies and the shapes that they generated as well. That was the big aha moment. The next aha moment was the fact that the plants were bent just above the soil. And again, you can't fake that. You just cannot hoax that kind of thing. The plants are always undamaged. And we also found that the plant's roots were pointing in the wrong direction. They're not going down towards the center of the earth. They're going sideways, which means the local gravitational field has been interrupted in some way. That we don't know. We can't explain that because we don't know enough about gravity yet, believe it or not. It's the strangest thing. We know so much about the universe, and we still don't understand gravity. And that's something that came from the channel material as well. It did say, the watcher said, that is to do with the illusion of gravity. So they're bending the laws of nature to manufacture crop circles. And here's the rub, because you go into a real crop circle, and I should say this quite categorically, there are hardly any real crop circles, and there have not been any since 2003. There's been mostly 99% hoaxing since then. It's like a conversation just came to an end. But should you be fortunate enough to find yourself in the real one, you might get one a year. I know at least a couple in America that happen in Ohio every year, a couple in the prairies in Canada every year. It's a very quiet thing now. It's almost like they're fine-tuning the conversation. If you find yourself in one, you'll have exactly the same experience as being inside the Great Pyramid or a Stonehenge or a Serpent Mound. It's the same technology at work for exactly the same purpose, which is to alter your state of consciousness so that you can connect to a final level of reality and hopefully extract some information from it, which is how people like myself came to the realization of how important the crop circles really are. I wrote a book for my part, which is still, from what I'm told, the Bible on the subject. It's been highly influential. I know people at NASA that have read it and have acted on the information in there, and they've gone on to build technology as a result of the information in crop circles. And I put it in the book deliberately because I was privy to the channel material that said, someone's going to be using this information to put the idea into scientists' heads in order to build a new type of energy device that defies gravity, but will also relieve our consumption of fossil fuels. And I know 3 people now who have built this device in 3 different countries, and it does levitate. So these are the implications of what we have in the crop circles. And it ties into sacred space as well, because we stopped building sacred sites for the last 2,500 years, really. The Gothic cathedrals are the only exception. So the crop circles are filling in a gap in our history that are telling us and showing us the connection to nature and the divine. They're like the doorway in between worlds, and the people who interact with these doorways, they come back very changed. Their lives are completely altered 180 degrees, and they've gone on to do extraordinary things. I've given up my lucrative career to do this, and I don't regret a second of it. I've now become a teacher of this new spiritual technology, as have many others. So it is part of the change. The crop circles are part of the change, just like back in the day, pyramids were also part of the change as well. Because they also were part of introducing people to another level of reality when you interact in the same way. So when it comes down to it, there's nothing really new that we're experiencing here. They're just showing things in a very different way. Although I would love them to build a pyramid in the middle of a field overnight. That would be quite.
Is there any connectivity between the locations of these crop circles, the authentic ones that have happened?
Absolutely. They're all appearing exactly on the same cross points of the Earth's telluric currents. And here's the best part. No matter where they appear in the world, in 26 countries, they also appear besides ancient sacred sites. And I was very lucky to have made a connection early on, and almost by accident in a way. I was actually monitoring the sacred sites in England while I was researching crop circles. So during the winter, when there's nothing going on, I go to the local sacred sites, I do measurements, I work with my colleagues to pick up frequencies and things. And then almost by coincidence, a crop circle would appear next to the sites that we've been working on only a few months earlier. And suddenly we thought, well, wait a minute, I wonder if the crop circle is on the same energy line as the temple. And of course it was. Does it influence the energy of the temple? And we go back to the temple and found that the imprint of the crop circle has transferred to the local temple. And suddenly, in the last 20 years, we've seen a resurgence in attendance at sacred sites around the world, sometimes too much. There's a lot of trivial touristic stuff going on, but you know, out of all of those thousands of people that go to the sites, a few will be likely to be awoken, and then they will be changed, and they become part of the change in humanity. I think that that's what's really happening. It's a very soft way of altering human consciousness in a way that we're doing it for ourselves. The crop circles bring attention. They send the information to local sites, and people are attracted to the sites, and somehow they're altered in some way. It's a very elegant way to actually move human consciousness along in a non-threatening, almost artistic way, a very loving way.
Why have we stopped building these sacred sites? If there's so much power involved, did we just seriously forget what these sites were over all those millennia?
Oh, I think it goes through the cycle of human consciousness. I think we were, again, going back to the Vedas in India, for example, they do show that there are specific times in human history that we go through experiences. There'll be a golden age, for example. There'll be another kind of age that is to do with chaos. And then we're in this current age, which is to do with the understanding of the lack of spiritual connection. The greed, the me culture, the selfie culture, and it's all coming true. Now, they wrote this thousands and thousands of years ago. They had the ability to foresee the cycles that work in the heavens will repeat themselves down here on earth. And we, being children of the earth, will basically become a outward manifestation of these experiences. So we are going through a phase where we would lose our divinity, only at the very end to discover that it doesn't work, and then a new age, another cataclysm will come along in a second, wipe everything out, and we will start again like children and start another age. That's the way it's always been. And if you look back far enough, we're part of that cycle, and part of that cycle was to go for a time when we would destroy the sacred sites, we would stop building them, we'd start creating organized religion, which does everything but connect you to the source. I mean, it's actually a bit of a perversion to call it religion. If you go back to the original word, which is religio, it's in the Latin term, it means to reconnect with the source. And I have not seen any organized religion so far that actually helps you reconnect with the source, because there's always a middleman involved, and it's usually a guy nailed to a cross. It's another story altogether.
Well, I think there's a difference between religion and spirituality. I think they're two totally different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And faith.
Absolutely.
I think everybody have faith. It doesn't even matter if it's misplaced. If it makes you happy and it creates a doorway to something bigger that improves you, I'm all for it. You know, as long as it doesn't impinge on someone else's ideas. I think that's the best way to go about it. But it is funny how these things are starting to play exactly in the way that they were foretold. And one of them was the lack of consciousness, the desecration of the site, and the lack of inner godliness. And I think in the end, we're going to have to discover that we are the gods we've been waiting for. There is that sort of God within. And I think Jesus said it as well, very well. The temple of God resides within you. It's not out there. It's not an external thing. It's you. We are expressions of a Godhead that's trying to experience itself in this multiplicity of billions of people. And we're having the experience for this central figure, whatever you want to call it. And I think that ultimately we'll come to find that we don't need the temples. We are the temple. We can do it. We don't need an exterior thing to say, hey, I feel really good and spiritual. If you can do that within yourself, and anybody who practices Kriya Yoga knows this already, they will realize that you don't need an external stimulus. Although, having said that, I kind of do like traveling to big temples and impressive places because they are ever so nice.
Well, recharging yourself and your soul and your body and your aura and everything that is you infinitely in a sacred site is completely different than walking into a man-made, pew-funded church. It is completely different. It is leaps and bounds apart from each other. What I feel sitting on the beach watching the waves roll in, I'm never going to receive walking into a building and having somebody yell at me the way that I should live.
That's right.
I'm not downing anybody else for their choices, but by golly, I have mine, and I will live and die by them. And that is what makes my soul happy. And I think that that's what we're supposed to find within us, is what makes us be the best possible humans that we can be, not only to ourselves, but to each other.
Exactly. In fact, it reminds me of an experiment I played years ago with people, demonstrating the power of again, going back to intent, and that we're very, very powerful people. We're very powerful temples within ourselves. There was a group of people that I was leading on one of my first tours in England, and they were desperate to see a real crop circle, and I hadn't seen one for weeks. So someone heard that there was one over the hill and said, all right, we'll go over there. And we went in, and everybody's very excited. And they asked me, said, what do you think? I said, well, I hate to break you the news, but this one's been assisted, if you know what I mean. You know, you got to bring people down gently. But I said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make it into a real crop circle. Really? I said, yes, we're going to make a real crop circle. So we got the electrodes out, we got dowsing equipment out. One's cheaper than the other. They both give you the same response. And I said, we're going to sit here in this geometric shape on the ground, made by people. There's no energy here. There's nothing here. There's only subterfuge and lying, because that's what I call it. We call them crap circles. I'm sorry if this goes on the air. We have a bit of a sense of humor in Britain. There's crop circles and crap circles. So
Right.
we're in this fake thing. And I said, you know, but churches, Gothic cathedrals, which are built exactly on the same principle as a pyramid, they're also man-made. So why don't we sit in this geometric shape with our little temples and just focus, okay, and put our intent into the actual geometric shape, and just utter a word of love, or a feeling of affection, or even a sound, something that you want to live here as a creative element. And they did for about 15, 20 seconds. And then we got the probes out and the dowsing rods, and the energy was vibrating all the way up halfway to the field. And I said, congratulations, you just made a real crop circle, because that's what it is. You know, it's about energy. It's not even about the geometry. It's not about the shape. It's about the energy of it. And it's the same thing with the pyramid. The stones are great. The chambers are great. But it's the energy that's doing what it does to you and for you. And ultimately, that's the most important thing. And they went home very happy. I mean, there's a huge lesson, because now they're going to go and use that same technique wherever they happen to be. You might be in a boat or a church, but they'll put that intent in there, and they'll start to create these little energy fields around the world. If we did that 6 billion times, imagine how the world would be overnight.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's one thing that we don't pay enough attention to, is not only is our energy within us, but it is transferable to others. And we have to be very aware of that transference and the marks and the residue that we leave, not only on other people, but on locations. On everything we touch, we leave a part of us and take a part of somebody else. And we have to be really aware of that, monitor that, and almost nurture it to be something better than we are.
Yeah. We are the app we've been looking for.
Yes.
There you go. Nice. Well, we are getting down toward the end of the show. I wanted to get in a couple of these questions real quick from the chat room before we do sign off here. So Shauna, our chat shenanigator, asked, going back, you had mentioned fairies quite a while ago. And so she was wondering if you had actually ever encountered any fairies during your travels.
Oh, God, yeah, but they never work the way you think they are.
They're ornery.
Yeah.
How do they
because
work for you? Because we believe we have encountered some as well. So I'm kind of curious as to your experiences.
Well, it's to do with how the universe really works relative to how we perceive it. I mean, if we have enough contact with the spirit world and we ask enough questions, and that was one of my questions that I kept asking during our special moments in our spiritual group, was what do you actually look like? And I said, well, you can't even begin to understand what we look like. We're a different frequency, and the frequency is so different to yours. Just think of us as sound and light, because that's the way we see you. We don't see you as physical people. We see you as little bits of sound and different bits of light, depending on how you're feeling. And but you know, when you connect with us in certain places, we try to project an image into your mind that will give you an idea of what we look like, but that's not really what we look like. It's an outward expression. It's an ideal view of what we actually look like, and it's also relative to who you are culturally. And I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense, because when I was in Ireland, we're cleansing some graveyards, and I sort of felt like I had my hands down by my side, and someone was kind of picking at my hand, and looked down, and this is this little gnome creature with a big bald head and a big belly with little spinny little legs, and I'm picking him up like this, and he was making a hell of a racket. I said, all right, I'll put you back down again. And it's the strangest experience to see this. But you know what? You talk to Persians in Iran or Iraq, and they'll say, you know, we have exactly the same beings, but they're more like, they have like a sort of a pointed little head, and they're dressed in sort of little red costumes. but we're talking about the same beings. It's just that culturally, they put the idea into our heads, an image into our heads that makes us culturally acceptable. And I like that idea because you read about the folklore in different parts of the world. They're talking about the same people, but they're dressed in a different way. And I find that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, the fairies are everywhere. The gnomes, the serpents, they're very mischievous. They have a very mischievous sense of humor as well. But that's not quite what they look like in the real world of in the big universal scheme of things.
Bless you, Vanessa. Yes, you're okay. Bless you.
Thank you.
And then we had one from April, going back to the frequencies that are being tapped into here. How are those frequencies being created to begin with?
Oh my God! If I had the answer to that, I would be a very rich man. That's like saying
that's a $64 million question, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's like, what is God? That's the big question we all want to know. Where does it come from? The one thing that I am very aware of is that when we pick up information here on Earth to do with the other world and other levels of reality, it starts off as a thought from their level of reality. It's an electromagnetic envelope of energy. It travels through time and space, through the vacuum. And once it hits our atmosphere, it starts to condense because it's hitting a physical substance. So the first thing we do is we see it as a beam of light coming down or as an orb. That's the other common thing. You see a lot of those. And then the next thing is that you hear the actual frequency associated with that. So what you're actually picking up is a thought form that's traveled through time and space, and it's physicalized in our space-time continuum, and you see it as light, and then you hear it as sound. But it's a super physical phenomenon. It's an approximation of what it really is. And that's the best I can describe it based on personal experience. But where it comes from, well, your guess is as good as mine.
Fair enough. Well, we are at our hour mark. So, Freddy, where can everybody find you? And I'm going to go ahead and put your books up on the screen here so everybody can. And you have a brand new book that just came out.
Yes, and the new one is just come out 2 days ago. In fact, it's so new, the picture isn't even up yet on there. It's called The Missing Lands. Oh, there it is.
Yep, there's a new one.
Which I was trying to get out 8 months ago before Graham Hancock wrote his next book, and we both came out with a book on the same day.
Yeah, his book just showed up on my my audio list today. So when are you going to bring your books to audio? Because I do a lot of driving, a lot of traveling, and I just pop those books on and listen.
There's not much of a demand for them. You can't make a penny for them. And also the people that I wanted to use for the audio books, which was John Hurt was my main guy. He's passed away.
Right.
I always wrote with John Hurt in my head, or James Coburn. He's got a great voice.
You know, honestly, Freddie, my girlfriend Shauna and I have talked about this a number of times. You have a fantastic voice. You really do.
Why don't you do it?
10,000 words on a mic. I might just do it one day when I have a free moment, which is very rare these days.
Right.
But thank you. You just never know. But you can find all that stuff at invisibletemple.com.
Okay, invisibletemple.com. That's the place to go. Yeah, definitely pick up Freddy's books. I'm going to have to get the new one here, Missing Lands. The one that I showed earlier, Divine Blueprint, fantastic book. There's so much information in here. I'm gonna have to go through it again. It's
that one's like the Cliff Notes compared to the Missing Lands.
Oh, really? Okay.
It turns out that the new one's actually kind of a sequel to the Divine Blueprint. I never planned it that way. Just the way it happened. Nice. But I want to go back to the pre-origin of temples. I want to go back before the flood and what was happening before the flood and who were all these gods. It turns out they're all connected to each other. And I've also found, we keep talking about Atlantis and Lemuria. It turns out there's a third missing continent. And I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's extraordinary. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely have to pick it up then. And you mentioned Graham Hancock earlier, and a point that I never got around to making throughout our conversation tonight that I think is really fascinating is that the two of you were basically researching much of the same information independently and came to many of the same conclusions, which I think is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I had the same conversation with him when I saw him, and I apologized for one thing, because I said, I was coming up with this idea about a project I was working on. Didn't realize that you were doing the same thing, and we came to the same conclusion from different points of view. So, you know what, we're borrowing from the same source. Ultimately, if we can reach the same conclusion from different points of view, it validates each other's work.
Absolutely.
It's not plagiarizing. We're just helping each other prove a point.
Yeah, you're reinforcing all of that. Absolutely.
Exactly. And there's many people like me and him, and that are doing the same thing, and all our threads are crossing at little points, but we're all going on our own little individual journey. He's concentrating on America right now. I'm concentrating on the Pacific and the people before the flood, which is very important, that I don't think anyone's ever done. I mean, we keep talking about the gods and all of this, but who were they? Where did they live? And how are they connected, if they were at all? It turns out they are all connected. And it was a story that just blew my mind. So it's 100,000 words, this one. It's going to keep you up for a few weeks.
All right. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it. Invisible.com, everybody. Freddie, thank you so much for coming on. I absolutely appreciate it.
Good to talk to you.
All right. You have a great night.
It was nice to meet you.
Keep up the therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's going to have to get something. Thanks again, Freddie. You have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.